You're welcome back. And of course, the main concern of many after hearing of the collapse of 5 more banks was what happens to the workers. We all saw how it turned out for those who worked for UT Bank and Capital Bank following the purchase and assumption of some of the assets of those banks by GCB Bank. Today, those workers who found themselves out of job are yet to receive compensation from their former employers. Today, we want to understand the labor issues surrounding that, and we've got the absolute best person to help us navigate them. Let's say good morning to John Esiapa. He's a council member for Labour Policy International. John, how nice to see you, and thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you. Good morning, and nice being with you this morning.
Excellent. Good morning to you too. Now, of course, this matter is a big worry. We've already heard of workers who have had to find alternative means following a career being a manager or some other highly placed employee for Capital Bank or UT Bank. And today, 1 year on, they are yet to be paid. First, let's try and clarify the confusion about what they are entitled to and from whom that entitlement ought to be paid. Our understanding is that they were absorbed by Ghana GCB as good assets, right, or good liabilities, because it was only the good assets and liabilities that the GCB Bank took on.
Yeah.
So if you are good assets or good liabilities, then surely if they are letting you go, then normal law should apply and they should be compensated. Am I wrong?
Yes and no. But before I delve into that, we are not privy to the purchase and assumption agreement. What exactly is in that agreement? We don't know. So we'll be second guessing the issues. But like you rightly said, that happened, and GCB assumed responsibility over the assets, customers, and the staff. But then the 2 banks, in quote, also we are told collapsed, and it also ceased to exist. So it also has its own implications. What seems to be happening now is for the collapsed banks to settle all the workers, and GCB continues with them. That is their understanding. So it means that whatever is due them will be paid by the receiver. That is what, and whether it is the right thing to do, we can't tell, because we don't have further information on the agreement between GCB, Bank of Ghana, and the other 2 banks. So, but what is of interest is what GCB expected these workers to do. And at what point can GCB lay them off? Workers have rights. They are not equipment or buildings, and their rights are enshrined in the law. So how you engage workers and how you disengage them is prescribed by law, and there's a practice as well. We hear GCB is put them under probation. Well, whether probation is the appropriate thing to do or not is subject to discussion. But by assumption...
Sorry, are you talking about Consolidated Bank or GCB? Because Consolidated Bank is the ones that regards the most recent 5.
Okay. Okay.
The 5 most recent banks that were purchased and assumed.
Okay.
But GCB regards UT Bank and Capital
Bank, yes, yes.
So did GCB put them under probation as well?
That is the information we have. And GCB is yet to clarify. But to the extent that we've not had any information, and the workers, in fact, some of those workers who were put under probation and whose appointments have been terminated, have come out to confirm. So we have no reason to doubt that. But we are saying if that is what has happened, then we must take a second look at it, because workers of the defunct banks, I don't think they applied to join GCB. GCB needed them at the time of assumption. They needed those workers. When you place somebody under probation, it means you would have clearly defined what you expect that person to do. And at the end of a certain period, you do an assessment. It doesn't appear to be the case.
I want us to look at some details that have been shared, legal details on this matter, to help inform our discussion. These are bits of information that have been provided on the situation with UT Bank and Capital Bank. So essentially it says that the reportage on the ex-employees of UT and Capital Bank so far gives the erroneous impression that some persons in authority are being derelict in their duties. It goes on to say, GCB did not take over these failed banks. It assumed some selected assets and liabilities of these banks in the purchase and assumption arrangement with the receiver, which was PwC. But the rest of the assets and liabilities of these banks remained with the receiver. And it goes on to say, GCB did not assume employees' severance package. It rather took on some of the employees and let the rest go. It is the receiver who, if anything at all, would have to speak to issues about the plight of ex-employees. Now, this is interesting. There's more. Even the receiver is limited in this discussion because Section 135 of Act 930 sets the order of priorities and payments by the receiver, which cannot be breached, seeing that these failed banks have huge debts owed to creditors, Bank of Ghana, etc. It is doubtful if the receiver can recover enough to pay even the list under Section 135. Now this is interesting, because my understanding is that there was a bond, 2.2 billion Ghana cedis, which the government of Ghana went for. Now, the money from that bond, was it paid to GCB or did it go to the receiver to clear off these obligations? Okay. Now, what I just read to you are the views of a lawyer who wishes to remain anonymous. He said a lot more. He included this: payments to anyone on the list would be made, and he's talking about the receiver's list of those that the entities owed money to. Payments to anyone on the list would be made after the receiver had recovered enough of the assets of these failed banks, which is proving to be a huge task so far. The employees should produce for your scrutiny what documentary promises the receiver has made to them. Is there more, or are we done? All right. Well, it would appear that this is what the lawyer is sharing so far. And it is an interesting perspective. I don't know. How does this link with labor law, first of all?
Generally, what the lawyer has said is true. But there's a dimension that must be brought to bear. Like you rightly said, GCB assumed responsibility for the workers. The law also talks about severance of a legal relationship. But by the assumption undertaken by GCB, it can be argued that there was no severance because, you know, they continue to perform their duties. The only change was in the fact that there was no UT and there was no capital. And so the workers should have continued and moved on with their length of service and everything. What was likely to change will be their conditions, because they will now be under the GCB conditions of service.
Now,
that is what logically should have been done. But
okay,
I've just indicated that we did not, or we do not have information, or we are not privy to the purchase and assumption agreement. You can't treat a worker who is continuing to do his work as if he is no longer a worker. So if we continue to accept that they are part of what GCB has assumed, the issue of their payment doesn't come in. And there wouldn't have been the need for a severance discussion. Even what motivated the severance discussion, we don't know. Okay? Because you've just told us what the law actually says. Because you can't foresee what you are going to get at the end of the liquidation process.
I want to pick up from where we left off reading the opinion of this lawyer. He said also, although one sympathizes with the plight of these ex-employees, it should be understood that no one owes them their severance package apart from what the receiver may give from excellent recoveries or windfall, if possible. He continues, and I'll share that with you in a moment as soon as it comes up on the screen. Non-banking sector employees don't get anything in terms of severance package when their businesses collapse. This is sadly the fact of life, so we should let the public understand the issues and let it not sound as if someone is being irresponsible. Let me read that last one before we discuss what he's saying. And he ends by saying, we must understand the transaction that happened between the receiver and GCB. The banks failed. The employees had no jobs. This is interesting. Particularly what he's saying about workers in the non-banking sector. I don't know where he's getting that detail from. But is it true that if you don't work in a bank and you lose your job, you don't get severance pay? Was severance pay invented only for bank workers?
Perhaps the lawyer may have been referring to the non-formal sector, or if you own your own business and it collapses, what do you do next?
Well, doesn't the law protect employees of in that situation too?
The informal sector?
Yeah.
It does, but I'm saying most of the informal sector workers are self-employed. So if you have your own job and it collapses, where do you turn for severance?
So,
but once you are a worker, you have been engaged by an employer, there's a relationship governed or regulated by law. And we can't treat workers as if they were inanimate objects.
Please, I want to clarify this because it's news to me. Someone in the informal sector employs someone to work for him or her.
Yes.
That employee has rights.
Oh, yes.
Do they not?
Oh, yes.
And is severance not part of those rights?
No, to the extent that the person is an employee, he has rights, even in the informal sector. And that person is entitled to pursue his rights.
So if they are not given severance,
yes.
they have a case.
Oh, yes.
Right. I
yes.
wanted to clarify that
yes.
because
every worker has rights. For instance, let me tell you, from Labour Policy International, we don't just talk about the ordinary workers, those in management, and they even bear the brunt the most. The MDs, the directors, and so on, who are part of this organization, they also have rights. Unfortunately, we only look at workers as those down there, but management people have been engaged by the organization, and their rights should not be trampled upon. We hear all kinds of things being said about these managers and executives and so on. We should be careful. They also have rights. They are employees.
You see, I wanted to clarify that because the lawyer's opinion that we just read made it sound as if you don't work in a bank, then you're not entitled to severance.
I think he's
surprised.
I want to believe he's, because of the current circumstances, he's narrowed it down to the banks.
Right.
But
well,
the
other thing is we need to clarify this bond that we went for, the 2.2 billion. It makes me worry, you see. It makes me worry because we're now going for a 5.7 billion CD bond for the 5 banks that have just collapsed. Okay, moving away from UT and Capital for a moment. That's a lot of money, and that's our money. Okay, you and I. So I am very curious. If none of that money is meant to pay the severance of employees who are no longer to be engaged by the new entity, then what exactly, were those employees and their severance not calculated as part of assets and liabilities? And why is it that the receiver must try and retrieve money before he can then pay those that the collapsed entity owes? Isn't that the point of the bond that they went for? Isn't it a calculation of those toxic assets that led to the amounts that they are going to borrow? And if they borrowed that money, should it not be used in that manner to pay off those that the collapsed entities owe money to, which would then include the workers?
You know, the law is clear on what happens in the case of liquidation, and perhaps that will inform why they will not be paid severance until at a certain point. And if it were not so, then is the redundancy or severance negotiation that will determine. And that is why at a point when we heard that there has been a negotiation between representatives of the workers, which is they got a union to do so, and whoever they negotiated with, we were asking questions. What mandate? Where did they get the funds to determine that this is what should be paid? In any case, some of the workers have indicated they've not even seen the agreement that was reached. So if it was handled under a liquidation process, then it will be difficult to accept that there is a package that has been negotiated, because the law is clear on how these things are dealt with. I want to share with you, defunct Ghana Airways. It was sad when we sat in that negotiations. At that time, we represented the pilots. It started with a redundancy negotiation, but the demands of the workers were said that management was unable to meet the demands, and workers were were not ready to accept what management was offering. But certain comments came up, and management, then went into liquidation. They went on the liquidation route, and everything else was out of our hands. Because once we get into liquidation, you can't discuss severance or redundancy. Fortunately for us, representing the pilots, we accepted the offer from management and signed off. So the pilots were paid. The other staff, you saw what happened. It took some years, through struggles. But again, government, together with the stakeholders, had to find something to pay to them. So if it's a redundancy, then the issue is more confusing than we thought. Because the purchase and assumption agreement assumes that they are continuing. Then we are told that there is a redundancy negotiation, and at the same time, it's a liquidation. It's murky. We need more information so we can all advise on how to proceed on this matter. Fortunately, I don't know why, but the unions representing them should provide as much information as possible to their members, because they appear to be confused.
Is it possible that the union doesn't have information?
No, but you see, the workers, we are here, and there are many experts. Nothing stops. Even if you have a lawyer, you can still consult other lawyers. All we want to do is to make sure this thing is wrapped up nicely, and then we move on, show national maturity, and move on and deal with the more serious matters of saving the finance sector.
For UT and Capital Bank, is it the case that there hasn't even been a negotiation with the workers as to how much they will be paid if there is a windfall, or if the receiver is able to retrieve enough value from the assets to pay all those that the entities owed, including the workers? Has there been a negotiation about how much each worker will receive?
The workers have told us that there has been a negotiation and they are waiting for their package.
So everybody knows how much they are supposed to get.
I have asked some of the workers who are making the claim whether they have seen the agreement, and nobody can point to an agreement. So there are issues. They got some union to lead them. The information should be shared. There should be a general meeting so workers, the affected workers, can ask the relevant questions so their representatives will address them.
Now, it also goes back to the issue of whether the receiver, on his list of people he must pay, whether there is even the option of perhaps paying them some of it rather than all of it, and then as he receives more, he pays those he owes a little bit more. Is that an option available to a receiver, or will he literally have to pay off completely some of the debts, and then when he gets to them, wherever they are on his list, then he can deal with it?
Oh, as for implementation of an agreement, it's subject to discussion by the parties. Everybody would want to be paid everything in full, and I'm off. But if it's a liquidation, then I don't see how, in the midst of the current crisis, a receiver would want to bend the rules. I don't know. If the law says this is how you should go about it, it will be difficult in these circumstances to try and circumvent the law.
So this aspect, this whole thing about what this legal opinion is suggesting, that look, it's actually the receiver that should be paying and not GCB. Let's unpick that, because you make the important point that these workers were not handed off to a receiver. They were handed over to GCB Bank. They worked for GCB Bank for a period of time, beyond which they were then terminated or, asked to go home. So as at the time they were asked to go home, they were employees of GCB Bank, were they not? So why is this whole thing about palming them off to the receiver? Is that actually what the law says?
That is why I've raised the issue of the agreement. The purchase and assumption agreement will have those details. And again, at what point did you purchase and assume? And at that point of assumption, the workers are telling us that there were meetings and they were promised The GCB made promises that, oh, they won't lose their jobs and so on. But you see, when it comes to the industrial relations aspect, you ask yourself, when the assumption took place, were the workers performing the same duties? You and I know yes, because they were asked to serve the customers.
Keep doing what they were doing.
Exactly. Yeah. So at what point were they on probation? Probation to do what? And that's why we are saying that if the workers have proper or the right experts to guide them, there wouldn't have been this issue. And again, as labor policy, we also advise employers. I think that GCB, Bank of Ghana, was party to that whole arrangement, and the other stakeholders, we need to go back. What are we doing wrong? Can we amend?
Let's also look at this the new arrangement for the 5 banks that just collapsed. Now, in their case, we have cited a letter signed by the managing director of Consolidated Bank. He is writing to the workers, not the receiver. The managing director of Consolidated Bank has written to them and said, we're going to work with you for 2 weeks to assess whether or not we should keep you. Oh, 60 days, forgive me, not 2 weeks.
So that's
2 months, rather, is what I was trying to say. 60 days. That letter came from the managing director, not from the receiver. Does that make a difference? Does this indicate that Consolidated Bank has taken responsibility for these workers? And therefore, if for any reason any of them are let go, the obligation is on Consolidated Bank to give them severance?
I think it comes back to the same issues, I mean, similar to UT and Capital. You see, as we speak, we have Consolidated Bank. And then there is a receiver for the 5 banks. Consolidated Bank was not a bank at the time the 5 banks were merged or were transformed into Consolidated Bank. So Consolidated Bank is as new as the workers. In fact, if we want to talk about job continuous employment, then you can say that workers in the 5 banks are doing exactly what they used to do. What will change? Perhaps Consolidated Bank will come up with a mission statement, new letterheads, new systems, and so on. But they've carried on with the customers, assets, and deposits, everything into Consolidated Bank. But again, the question I want to ask, is there a board for Consolidated Bank on whose authority is management acting? The same issues that we've been talking about. Let's make sure that Consolidated Bank takes off mindful of what has led to its formation. You understand? So
these are
the workers of Consolidated Bank, I will advise that they seek
legal advice.
Yeah, they must be properly guided.
These are 5 different banks.
Yeah.
Each one had different conditions of service for their employees.
Exactly.
Now, all of these employees are employees of one bank, if we are to go by this letter that the CEO of Consolidated Bank wrote to all staff. At least for 60 days, they are all employees of Consolidated Bank. How exactly does Consolidated Bank go about, enforcing conditions of service and so forth? Are they all going to be put on some sort of level playing field, or is there going to be a need for, segmenting the conditions of? Well, how exactly for these 60 days? What is the nature of the relationship between Consolidated Bank and these workers?
In fact, management must seek advice and be guided. Look, you are going to assess somebody over a period of 60 days. In at the workplace, you don't just get up to assess. You assess based on targets and objectives that you have set. Again, you have raised the issue. What are their conditions of service? Has anybody given them any role to play and said, you need to achieve A, B, and C by this time, after which we will do an assessment? All these things are not there. So there must be a transition. Within the transition, we can harmonize or come up. Formulating conditions of service is not a difficult thing. There are standards, and there are certain requirements that the law would want you to fulfill. If within the transition you put things together, and that is if we respect our citizens, if we respect workers, then we will not treat them as a 60-day workers.
So 60 days is not enough?
Look,
is that what you're suggesting?
You see, by practice, when you give somebody a target, you assess usually over a 1-year period, because it will take time for you to provide the necessary tools and guidance and training for the people to perform. It's not a matter of 60 days. So whatever it is that is being done, we don't know. But some of us are beginning to harbor or have the feeling that the workers have only been asked to hold on. The system they will feed into a certain system. When it is harmonized, then they are made to go. Let's not do that to our citizens. These are Ghanaians. They are workers. They are protected by law, local law and international law. The ILO has conventions on these matters. Then our labor laws and practices are also clear on these matters. Okay, these are workers. They have continued to be on the job. Nothing has changed. Their customers know them. If we still had those 5 banks and there had been assessments and some have been determined not to be performing, even there, they are given additional time to what? To make amends. And there's a performance management system that will have to be employed. Consolidated bank shouldn't make any mistakes. But you and I agree that the likelihood of loss of jobs is very high. Because you see, where you have 5 banks, and most of them are all having a facility, you know, you go to certain areas, and all the banks are there.
Yeah.
You are now going to have one consolidated bank. So some of the branches, you understand. So these will happen. But the way to address it is not 60-day ultimatum. Perform. Perform what? So there are real issues. Management has real issues on hand. Must sit, analyze, seek proper advice, and then this thing will be done humanely. And the maturity of our country and leadership will be recognized.
Right. Well, let's certainly hope that it will be done humanely. But until then, John Isiapa, thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you
ever so much.